Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. If you're listening to this lesson, most likely you're beyond the level when you would be blundering pieces or your opponent. So the issue will be that when you're both playing normal, reasonable moves, who makes better plans and also who outcalculates the other. It may be a 2 or 3 move variation that you need to calculate and evaluate correctly, or a longer one. One of the big differences among masters or even more successful players and amateur players is that the more experienced players see deeper and see oftentimes that one fine move at the end of a variation. And we will see examples of those little fine moves that make all the difference in the world. When most people stop their calculation, the masters or grandmasters go that one move further. So let's see some situations. Here we go. Here is our first example, which looks like a simple looking rook and knight versus rook and bishop endgame. At the moment, black has an extra pawn. However, their bishop is under attack. And black has to be careful, very careful, in what to do. On one hand, there may be a skewer situation on the 8th rank, and there is even something else. As usual, I suggest you take your time, of course, without any outside help of a computer, and try to figure out on your own, if you were black in this position, what would be your move not to lose the game or any material. Well, when you come back, hopefully you found the only correct move. But before we look at that, let's investigate some other possible options. Well, as I mentioned, the black bishop is under attack. It cannot be protected, so it better moves, otherwise it will be lost. If the bishop moves, let's say, to e6, let's see what happens then. Well, we realize quickly that the skewer of rook a8 is not a real threat because after king takes knight, the king protects the rook on f8. So that's not to worry about. On the other hand, the problematic issue is, what if right now the white knight gives a check? And here comes in the problem, that the black king cannot successfully move to e8 near the rook because the game would end immediately after rook e7 checkmate. See, even in endgames, tactics are all around. Let's go back to the beginning and see again. Bishop e6, knight c6. On the other hand, if the king moves the other way, then indeed the skewer is around with rook a8 check. Let's go a bit further and see how this endgame spins out. Rook takes rook, king takes knight. So at this moment, obviously, white has won an exchange, which is a serious advantage. However, if the black king would be closer to its own pawns, for example on g7, the game would very likely be a draw. Now the problem is that white is able to go after black's weak pawn on h7 because the black king is so far from its defense. Black is likely to lose a pawn. However, white must play very accurately in this moment, making sure black will not get the opportunity to connect his right now lone unprotected h-pawn with the other chain of pawns by advancing it to h5, because then there would be a nice chain, the bishop protecting the base of the chain on f7, the f7 the g6 pawn, and then the g6 pawn the h5 pawn. Well, with that I think I gave away the hint. White's correct move right now is to play g4. Now if black would play h5, that wouldn't be helpful because after exchange of pawns, the rook could immediately go after the pawn on h5, which at this moment is unprotectable. Let's go back a few moves and see what if black does not play h5, but for example responds by playing f5. Now the idea is that the white pawn on g4 is under attack, and if pawn takes, bishop takes, then all of a sudden the g4 pawn no longer controls the h5 square, and upon the attack with the rook on the pawn can simply advance and black is back to business. But white can do better, and the correct move right now for white is to advance the g-pawn ahead to g5. Now black is stuck with the problem again, because after the pawn would advance to h5, white could do en passant and capture that pawn. Black can try to counterattack in the meantime, but those are only temporary deflections of the situation. King g2 protects the pawn, and now black has to give up on that pawn on h7. However, they can try to counterattack by bringing the king quickly towards e3 and try to attack the f3 pawn. Of course, white will have time to defend against that timely with rook h8, king d4, and then king f2, just making sure that black king doesn't end up on e3. e4, black can try to create a passed pawn, but the white king just on time will block the further advancement of that e-pawn. And this is a typical situation when we feel why the pair of bishops can be so valuable, because in this case black only has one colored bishop of the light squares, and the white king absolutely cannot be chased out from the dark square where it blocks the potential promotion of the black pawn on the e-file. And this is the type of situation when black would prefer to have a knight which could potentially attack dark or light squares. The game could conclude, for example, the following way: bishop f3, rook h6. Now if bishop h5, the problem is that the black king is a bit too far away to catch white's g-pawn after the little sacrifice with rook takes h5. On the other hand, after bishop goes to e4, white would pin the bishop with rook h4, and for example, king e5, king e2, and black gets in trouble because the e3 pawn will be lost. Let's go back to the beginning and see what black should do on the other hand. As weird as it may seem, the correct move right now is bishop to a8. Look at that. Of course, if rook takes bishop, king takes knight, and black maintained his extra pawn. And the best white can do is try to get a pawn back and then capture the bishop when the pawn endgame will be a draw with equal material. Or, after bishop a8, white may try a tricky move playing knight c8, which of course black is not obliged to capture and shouldn't. But black could play, for example, bishop b7. And then after knight d6, king c7, rook, knight takes bishop, king b6, rook a5, king takes b7, and rook wins the pawn back, again with a completely equal rook endgame. Let's move on to our second example in this lesson. Here we go. In this position, it is black's turn again, and just like in the last example, the black bishop is under attack. What should black do? Obviously, black has numerous options. In addition to moving the bishop that's being attacked, black has another alternative as well. So really the question is, in this case, should black move the bishop or should black play immediately the skewering move with bishop h6? Again, I suggest you take your time, try to come up with your own decision, and then come back, see if you were right. If black plays bishop h6, which in the actual game black did, it's true that black can gain some material, but it certainly wouldn't be the best option. Then the game would continue with queen takes. In fact, the game did continue this way. And takes, with the idea that black now could play b5 using the pin. It's true that black now wins the bishop, but obviously will lose his b pawn in return. So the game reached this position where white has a pawn and knight for the rook, which of course gives, materially speaking, some advantage to black. However, white has nicely connected passed pawns on the c and d files, which gives white sufficient compensation. In the meantime, black has missed a much better opportunity to win the exchange. The correct sequence was to move the bishop back immediately to d5. Now this not only maintains the threat of bishop h6 skewer, but also threatens to capture the white knight on e5 and then the bishop on c4. Therefore, white doesn't have the time to simply play b3, protecting the bishop, because then bishop h6. On the other hand, white doesn't have the time to move his rook, for example, from c1 to c2 out of the skewer, because then the bishop e5 move arrives. Unfortunately for white, moving the queen out from the skewer wouldn't help either, because then again bishop e5 would come, and if the queen captures back, then of course the queen no longer protects the bishop on c4. On the other hand, if the pawn captures, keeping both the queen and rook to protect the bishop, the problem is the black queen now also attacks the bishop, and either bishop or rook takes on c4 would give black a full bishop advantage. Okay, let's go back again to the very beginning, and after bishop d5, see what happens if white actually captures on d5. Well, now the correct move is not to recapture, which of course would give white time to escape from the troubles, but now comes the skewering move, bishop h6. It's important to note that trading the rooks first would be a serious mistake, because white, in addition to capturing back with the rook and putting the second rook into the skewer, would have the much better option and capture back with the queen. So now, after bishop h6, white cannot avoid losing material. Queen e4, black simply trades queens first, and doesn't matter which white piece captures back. Black captures the rook on c1 and has material advantage. Unfortunately for white, after bishop b7, black will win a pawn back immediately by capturing on b2, or possibly even by forking on e3 and grabbing the d4 pawn. Let's see the next example, which is a famous game between former world champion Anatoly Karpov and the German Grandmaster Robert Hübner. They have reached this position where white has missed a very cute tactical opportunity. Right now we have material balance, and white clearly has the initiative by having a well-positioned bishop on d5 and a rook that's already on the 8th rank, certainly causing fear for the black king. At the moment, the white rook is under attack, and the question is what to do. Again, take your time and then come back, check out the solution. The game continued with white playing queen to c4 in this position, protecting the rook, and the game eventually ended in a draw with black's correct defense. The missed moment was here, when white instead could have given the check with the rook, and then after king h7, this is an interesting moment, because the tempting tactical search would be trying to use the fact that the black queen is unprotected. So, if now white could successfully give up his rook, that's on g8 right now, then the white bishop could follow up by then playing bishop g8 with a discovery. And indeed, white would have an option to play rook g6 right now, and if rook takes back, then bishop g8. Or if king takes back, then bishop f7, still winning material. However, I bet Karpov saw this and didn't like the scenario that black would play rook d6, not capturing the rook with either piece. Now the black king is threatening to capture the white rook, and the white rook is kind of trapped other than exchanging rooks. Of course, if white exchanged the rooks on d6, white won a pawn. However, in view of the opposite colored bishops, probably Karpov wanted to keep as many pieces on the board as he could. The catch right now is that if the rook moves to g4, trying to keep the rooks on the board as well, black could play g5, and the rook cannot find peace on g8 either, because then black could capture the bishop on d5, and then the rook on g8. The correct move still is the check with the rook on g8. However, after king h7, the precise move is the very unexpected queen e3. Again, we're focusing on the unprotected piece, combining various threats. Now, doesn't matter pretty much where the rook moves, for example to f6, white has a checkmate into very pretty and elegant rook h8. And whether king moves out or captures the rook, the answer is queen h6. Well, even the best of the best make mistakes time to time, especially when they are short on time. This was one of those rare exceptions. Going back to the starting position in this case, how can you try to figure out such tactics? Well, I think that should be clear that you should be aware of the potential discovery. So the move rook g8, forcing the black king onto a light square, the same color that the white bishop is on, should be an obvious first try. Now, after that, rook g6, I think, is another move you should be able to figure out, very logical, just trying to use that discovery in the air. I admit the queen e3 and rook h8 plan is a trickier one to find out. However, this is when solving a lot of tactical puzzles and the creating pattern recognition comes in real handy. The more practice, the more experience you have in solving tactics, the more likely it is that that motive, that pattern will pop up in your head, that if the black king would be on h8, then there could be a potential checkmate tactic with queen checkmating on h6. Let's continue with our next example. Here we go. In this example, which is played between the Spanish Grandmaster Juan Bayon versus the Yugoslav Grandmaster Ubojevic, it was white's turn. And we can see several things immediately that are a bit awkward in black's position. One is the two unprotected pieces, the rook on a6 as well as the knight on c3, and also the fact that the black king and the black knight are on the same diagonal, again creating a potential forking or pinning situation. This is one of those examples then if white doesn't act timely and lets black recover, protect his pieces, black will be okay. However, white can act quickly right now and win material, using all those circumstances that I mentioned. Here the correct answer is white playing e4, making sure that knight cannot retreat to d5 and immediately attacking the knight on c3, leaving black with only one possible defense, protecting the knight with the queen. Now, we're using the second element, the fact that the black rook on a6 is unprotected, by moving the queen to d3, attacking that very rook, gaining time. Black needs to react to that threat, for example, retreats the rook. And now, white needs to do something quickly to win the knight on c3 that is trapped at the moment. However, black is about to rescue it if we don't hurry up. For example, if white would play rook a to e1 right away, with the idea to then play e5 to disconnect the defense of the black queen to the black knight, then all of a sudden the black knight simply escapes through a2 and then b4. Doing the same with the other rook would be insufficient either, because black immediately would play d5 with the idea to trade pawns and rescue the knight, and then after e5, rook takes. The white queen cannot successfully capture the knight because the white queen would end up on an unprotected square and black would have a discovery after rook e1. So let's go back to our position, and the correct move is only f2 to f4, and now black does not have a good way to prevent the upcoming e5. Just, by the way, queen d4 check with the idea to then fork with knight e2 does not work because white himself captures the queen with a check, not allowing the time for the fork. Let's move on. Here we go. This is our next example, where clearly the white king on g3 is in a very awkward position. In this beautiful example, black found a very pretty move to avoid the escape of the white king. If white would get a time, white would play d4 and then try to march to the other side with the king. Black needs to act quickly. The immediate rook h3 is not quite successful because white would capture, and then of course not take the pawn but just move to h2 and survive. Again, first try to figure out yourself the correct move and then come back to see the solution. And that amazing move is bishop g1, as unexpected as it can be. The point is that now the same rook h3 threat is unavoidable. On the other hand, if rook takes bishop, a beautiful epaulette checkmate comes with queen f4. And let's see our final example before the duel of the week. Here we go. In this position, white has an extra pawn, but they need to act quickly not to miss the tactical opportunity that's given at the moment. White missed the moment and played rook b2 when black responded with rook b4, and eventually the game ended in a draw, although white of course had still good chances to win. Here the winning opportunity was the amazing h6, followed by h5, threatening with checkmate. And if king h7, we're giving up the second pawn as well, all to open up the h file. King g3, and now black cannot avoid checkmate in a few moves. Check, king g5, and another beautiful combination. Check, if pawn takes queen g7, and otherwise queen h4. Well, this could be also the jewel of the week, but let's see anyway. The one I meant to be the jewel of the week, our final example in this lesson. Here we go. Here the task is to promote the a pawn to a queen without losing it, of course. The problem is if we push the pawn immediately, bishop g1 comes and the pawn will be lost. So white should try to move the king out of the diagonal before advancing the pawn. Let's see what happens if the king moves back to c3. Bishop g1, and white could try to play d4. The problem is black would play e5 immediately, and then if pawn advances, bishop takes d4, winning the pawn. So the only correct square to go to is to c4. However, the problem with this seems to be that it blocks the white bishop's way to d5, which we may need to catch black's advanced pawn. d4, h2. So now the problem is we stepped in the way of our bishop. And now comes the beautiful answer, check. And still we managed to get to the diagonal. But king captures. That's okay, because after pawn advances and both pawn promotes, we promoted with a skewer, and the black queen is lost. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and learned some important ideas and patterns to use in your own games. Thank you for listening. So long, until next time.